Hello, my friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day you are choosing to watch this set of videos. Welcome to week number 5 in our environmental science class. This week we are going to be looking at module 2.3, which is considering community ecology. So last week we focused a little bit more on population ecology, and now we're going to really dive into the greater aspect of community ecology. So hang with me. Let's do it. Okay, so for community ecology and with your book, this is going to focus on the Florida Everglades. Really fascinating ecosystem that Florida actually is working pretty hard at this point to preserve this area. And it's really quite fascinating, and this is thanks to also the work that scientists have done looking at various community populations around that area. So community ecology is defined as the study of all populations that are living and interacting in an area. It's also the study of how a given ecosystem functions. And they generally will look at these 5 questions here, and they will look at how the space is structured, why certain species thrive, say, over other species, how different species interact with each other, and also how energy flows through the food webs. Maybe you've heard of food chains, and that's a common way that we're kind of taught how things work, but we'll learn throughout this lesson that it's actually a bit more complicated than just one chain. I think a chain makes it imply that it's just one organism to another, to another, to another, when in fact it's a bit more complicated. So we'll discuss that later on. Then lastly, community ecology looks at how species contribute to ecosystem services. And there's all different kinds of services that an ecosystem can withstand and withhold. And this basically means that, you know, all the provisions that an ecosystem can provide. So here for the Everglades are some examples of ecosystem services. Water purification. This is actually really fascinating. It can take salty water and make it a bit more fresh and purify it from any other bacteria and things like that. Nutrient cycling, flood control, and this is frankly a very, very big aspect of the Everglades. Florida gets hit with hurricanes pretty often. It's a very moist area. It gets a lot of rain, very tropical in a sense. You can kind of think of it that way. And so Everglades really help with flood control. Groundwater recharge. So when it rains, the rain will go into the ground and then contribute to the groundwater. And we really, really need groundwater. It's one reservoir, if you remember the pools and processes assignment that you were supposed to do. Groundwater can be one of those reservoirs of fresh water. Pollination is a big one, not to be confused with pollution, but pollination. There's going to be several different types of plants that are out there, and our friends that are bees and birds can help with pollination, etc. So certainly not an inclusive list or an exclusive list, excuse me. So what's really fascinating is that many of these services are not very well understood, and they're not very well represented in economic development. And that's kind of a fascinating thing, I think, that we don't really take into account money. Though this can be changing, especially in more modern times. If we were to put dollar values on these services, the results would be staggering. So wetlands themselves help capture and store precipitation and runoff, which then releases downstream relatively slowly. This helps reduce peak flood levels and helps recharge groundwater. So here's just a map here as well to remind ourselves where Florida is. And where the Everglades themselves are. So the Everglades are kind of like down in that tip of Florida. And here's just a picture of what some of those, the Everglade region can look like. Looks very like really intricate river systems, and then also some greenery as well. Fascinatingly enough, and what I think is actually quite neat that we're studying this topic of wetlands, is the Bay Area of California. Our wetlands here do a very, very similar thing for us, where they store precipitation and runoff and help reduce flood levels. And with climate change and sea level rise, our local wetlands can benefit from restoration and protection to help us down the line with impacts of sea level rise. Actually, a very dear friend of mine does work for our local wetlands, or he's studying them quite heavily to kind of see the potential that they have, and to help our city managers and folks like that help protect these areas. The benefits monetarily could be insane. Flooding is extraordinarily expensive. If you are watching this in the spring of 2024, we just had some really intense winter weather systems come through here and dump a ton of rain all along the California coastline, and that led to a bunch of flooding and heavy monetary consequences. What's also really fascinating is community ecology also includes understanding how humans have altered these ecosystems, right? We often have numerous and significant impacts on ecological communities. Here are some of the impacts that we have done to the Everglades specifically. We have created canals, which has then channelized water. So it takes it from where it normally would have been naturally and made basically human-made channels, or canals, excuse me. Dams are a big thing as well. So, you know, maybe you think of beavers and building dams, but humans build dams as well. Going back to canals for a second. This can create fast-moving water in some parts and then dried out water areas in other parts. And the organisms that have adapted to various ecosystems likely did not do well. So say, for example, if there are some animals that live better in slow-moving water, then if they are now in fast-moving water, it's kind of a bad thing for them. They're not used to it. Similarly for dams, they can then, dams create very deep, slow-moving water with low oxygen levels. Again, going back to this idea that various animals have adapted to living in high oxygen areas or fast-moving water, so they probably had a difficult time adjusting to these man-made systems. Roads are a big thing that I don't think we really think of too much. Roads can cut off migration routes, can cut off waterways, can separate species from their food sources. So roadways can cause pollution in terms of air and noise pollution. Cars are noisy things, right? I live in downtown San Francisco. I hear cars all the time. If you're someone who likes to go out in nature, it's actually kind of fun to revel in the quiet, right? If you're out in the middle of nowhere, you just hear absolutely nothing. No buzz of the roads, no cars, no honking, things like that. And it's really quite lovely. I highly recommend it if you have any desire. So that kind of ties into this idea of pollution, but also water pollution is an issue here as well, from runoff from the roads and excess nutrients from local agriculture. So lots of different ways that we can pollute, unfortunately, the waterways. And this also, again, ties back to the Bay Area as well. Actually, a really large percentage of microplastics in local waterways here are actually from bits of tire. So your tires degrade. It's a thing, when it rains, you should check to make sure that your tires aren't bald and things like that. So where does all of that bits of tire go? Well, it goes into the air, which then can deposit onto the water. There's also these ideas of invasive species, intentional and unintentional invasive species, which is kind of interesting. Like humans can bring species intentionally, and it can have some down the road, down the line impacts of various ecosystems. Unintentional would be when boats from different countries come into port there can be different organisms and bacteria and things like that that attach to the ships, and then those can release unintentionally into a new environment. That's a big thing, a big issue here in the Bay Area as well. Then, of course, climate change. Humans are doing a number to this planet, and that overall has impacts to various ecosystems, but in this case that we're talking about, the Everglades. This is, of course, quite the list, but it's not the only impacts that humans can have. I encourage you to think if there are any other human impacts to ecosystems. So your book focuses on a specific species of animal in the Everglades, and that is of the wood stork. So these are an animal that are known as an indicator species, which means that they are very vulnerable to changes, but they can also help provide early warning signs to ecologists when we're looking at various ecosystems. So kind of a timeline of what scientists observed with this particular species is in the 1930s, there were around 15,000 to 20,000 pairs of wood storks in the southeastern United States. Then in 1948, Congress authorized a plan to then drain the Everglades. And after that, because water levels dropped so drastically, the wading bird population here decreased by 90%. 90%. That is just absolutely wild to me. So what happened here? Well, if we look at a food web here, this is infographic 2 from your book. We can kind of see basically what happened. So because of dams, dikes, and bridges, that made ecosystems either too wet or too dry. Again, going back to this idea where some species that have adapted to either living in a very dry condition or living in a very wet condition, then basically saw the opposite, then they weren't able to adapt quickly enough. So the wood stork in particular relied on the gradual drying of the Everglades. And each year, fish and amphibians would then be more abundant and dense where pools would dry up a little bit, right? Like, say, for example, here in the Bay Area, we have a wet season, we have a dry season. Florida is actually very similar. They have a wet season and a dry season. So during their dry season, that's when the frogs and amphibians and fish would then be more abundant for the wood stork to then go munch on, right? So this then forced the wood stork to fly further away from the nesting grounds in order to feed. And that is not great, right? The longer you are away from your nests, the more vulnerable your eggs are, and that can lead to predators then cashing in on those eggs. So oddly enough, or maybe what you can perhaps see from this food web is that wood storks were not the only species that were affected. The producers were highly impacted, producers being anything that is photosynthetic. So algae, sawgrass, bladderwort, things like that, which then leads to anything that relies on these to be heavily impacted as well. And that's what this slide here is trying to show. So if you don't have our primary producers, then that is going to basically deteriorate any other species that rely on them. And that can be a bit of an issue, right? Also, not just from dams, but there was what is an issue of agriculture that has released then synthetic nutrients, in this case phosphorus. So perhaps you recall from the biogeochemical cycling of phosphorus, right? And too much phosphorus then creates algae blooms, and algae blooms have their own issues. This is actually a really, really big problem in the oceans as well. This creates something called dead zones, but it can happen in freshwater sources as well, not just in the oceans. And then what also happened is because of the phosphorus, the sawgrass didn't really like that too much, but cattails is just another plant, really thrived. So sawgrass did not so great, but cattails did swimmingly. But these other creatures here don't rely on cattails, they rely on sawgrass, right? So just kind of like, again, changing these ideas here. So of course, the folks of Florida, city managers and community managers, things like that, this kind of, they're trying to fix things now, right? They actually, oddly enough, care very heavily about their environment. So this image here is just going through and indicating what the historic flow looked like from Lake Okeechobee and the flow from that. And there was a high level of complexity within the ecosystems, whereas now with current flow, it has been diverted away from the Everglades area from South Florida. So then it's channelized into other areas that no longer feeds into this wetland area. So the complexity of the ecosystems has been greatly reduced. And so restoration efforts would not only benefit animals, but it would also heavily benefit the residents of South Florida. So really be sure to review these ideas of concepts of niches in your book and why that can be important. So why do we care about species richness? Who gives a flying hoot? Greater species richness ensures greater community stability, so how stable things are. You're better able to provide more ecosystem services. If you recall back closer to the beginning of this video or of these slides, greater ecosystem services there. Then lastly, each species has their own ecological niche or unique role within an ecosystem. It's a pretty big thing here. And then there's also this idea of competitive exclusion. So no two species can indefinitely occupy the exact same niche in the same community. So that means then that one species excludes another one from a portion of the same niche as a result of competition for resources. This is also something, by the way, that can drive evolutionary changes within various species. So this can lead to different beak sizes or perhaps different evolutionary traits in terms of what you eat and how that's digested and where that comes into play further along down the ecosystem. I encourage you to try to think of examples in your everyday life of competitive exclusion. So greater species richness, of course, means a more resilient community. So we know that many species fill only a small part of a fundamental niche, which can then play a larger role or a different role, but is then limited due to competition and or resource partitioning. So when one species is in decline or is completely lost, then another one can take its place. However, as species richness declines, the community may not be able to bounce back. Thus, ecosystems are not able to then deliver the same ecosystem services. So kind of a lot going on here, I suppose, in this very simplified idea. But, and some ecosystems are more sensitive to changes than others, and that's a really interesting concept to wrap our minds around, right? So I encourage you to think of other ecosystems within perhaps your living area or where you're at or close to where you are, and consider how sensitive they might be to various changes. The last idea here that I want to touch on for this portion of the video series is looking at interactions among species. So perhaps you've heard of this idea called symbiosis, and that's essentially the four main interactions of symbiotic behavior, so mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and predation. And then what we've kind of already talked about are competition and resource partitioning. So be sure to be able to identify the interactions within the Everglades as well as in other ecosystems. So be sure to pause this video or go into your book and be sure to study these interactions closely. That is all for this particular video section. I know it was kind of long, so if you need to revisit some of these ideas, please, I encourage you to do so. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.